Thank you, AJ. I'm Ken Peterson from QuestionPro. I lead our customer experience function, our experience function, which focuses on customer experience, employee experience, patient experience. Today, I'm privileged to bring on an icon in the CX industry joining me today to talk about innovation in CX. And rather than me talk about him, I'll let Karl introduce himself a little bit here.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for elevating me to the status of icon. I never thought of myself as icon, but I'll accept that. Sounds pretty good to me. Anyway, as a matter of introduction, I'll tell you a little bit of story here about me. My focus on customers began many years ago in the days when I was working in the sciences in a laboratory environment. I spent the better part of my early career working with chemical and analytical instruments, which at one point introduced me to working directly with customers and demonstrating to them how technology could be used to solve their interest or their problem. And that's where I began developing my people skills to go along with my technical and content knowledge, which of course you need both to be successful. And that in turn led me down another path toward involvement in teaching customers how to use and apply the technology themselves. And in a practical sense, I showed them how they could use it to solve their own problems rather than rely on me. So there was a gradual progression from, the solitary confinement of a chemistry laboratory, which is the way it felt it sometimes, and then to the demo room, and then finally to the classroom, where I spent the better part of my mid-career in training and development. And then in 2004, I was offered an opportunity to manage customer experience for the company I was working for, a fire and life safety provider. They were known as Simplex Grinnell. Today they were acquired and they're now known as Johnson Controls. And it was during that time that I discovered the Customer Experience Professionals Association, or CXPA. And that was just forming in 2011. And I immediately joined them as a founding member, volunteered for several committees, eventually was elected to serve on the board of directors, which I did from 2011 to 2015. Then in 2014, I left the corporate world to start my own customer experience consulting practice, which is what I do today. And we offer both professional services and training. And along with a colleague and business partner, we developed what we call the CXPro course for customer experience managers, which is a training course that originally ran as an in-classroom event and is now an instructor-led online event due obviously to the pandemic, but will likely remain that way going forward as it has proven to us to be just as effective and just as successful. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that when I talk about CX education a little bit later in this webcast. So back to you, Ken.
Thank you, Karl. And today we're really here to talk about the topic of innovation in CX and really using CX not only to innovate within your CX, but using CX to innovate for your customers. And when I entered the industry, and Karl, you'll probably relate to some of this story, most surveys were still done by telephone or on paper. And I'll have to be honest, I came from a world where we were using computing a lot more, and it really bothered me. Even reports went out in big booklets that were bound together. At best, 2 weeks after data had been collected, most cases, information only going out quarterly. And I remember thinking I wasn't doing anything special, but I remember writing a reporting website written in HTML 1.0 that was pushing out data every 6 hours. Nothing dynamic, nothing special. But even then, I thought what I had pushed out there was going to be well embraced, but there was a lot of resistance, both from the client that was getting that data so quickly, not knowing what to do with it, and the company I was working for, because they said, "Hey, let's keep doing what we're doing. We do it well," rather than looking at the chance to move forward. So it was really the reason behind that pushback. We're invested in our approaches. And so oftentimes, whether it's for financial or our own reputation, we tend to push away innovation. And so I wanted to start with this question as sort of a teaser. You know, Karl, looking back at your history, what's been the worst example or violation of CX research and holding on to something far too long?
Well, you've asked only one thing, Ken, but so I can't share the 5 things that I might have had in mind here. But let me start with this one, Ken. You know, I've seen a lot of different ways to approach CX, but you said something that caused me then to recall a client that I worked with a few years ago that was doing exactly what you mentioned. They were gathering voice of the customer through a paper survey. Now, in this current day of receiving way too many emails, as we often do, you might even think that going back to paper and using the United States Postal Service, so far as they're still delivering, as the delivery vehicle and being a welcome alternative. And in some cases, that might even be a viable strategy, depending on the company and the culture and the customer's expectations. But in this instance, they were using postage paid business reply cards with several survey questions on the flip side. And the setup and situation was this. It was a transactional service event where a technician performed service on site and then handed this card to the customer after the service was performed and completed, and asking the customer to just simply fill out the survey form and either pop it into their internal outgoing mail system or in the nearest mailbox. But what was also happening at the same time was there was a contest set up around the survey process where the local office performing that survey and a service by rather than, and hence the survey, was incentivized in a couple of ways. Number one, they were incentivized on how many survey returns they could generate in a specific time period, typically a month. And then they were incentivized on how satisfied their customers were. So as you can well imagine, just from that description, that was a system ready and waiting for gaming. And that's exactly what happened. Those cards arrived back, they were addressed to the corporate office, and when they arrived, they often arrived in stacks of 10 or more, band-aided together. And they were often completed, as we started looking at the details of this, they were completed with the same handwriting and the same pen color, which got folks suspicious. And to the service manager's delight, most of the customers were considered satisfied. Service experience was measured by asking customers if there were expectations were either met, exceeded, or not met. And any customers whose expectations were either met or exceeded were considered to be therefore satisfied or 100% satisfied. And so the organization often reported anywhere between 95 and 100% customer satisfactions. So there you have it, a system set up to guarantee that you'll get the greatest customer satisfaction results that you want to report on in those, reports that you talked about and to brag about. And of course, eventually that was exposed as not a best practice and then replaced with a telephone-based system of voice of the customer, which then created another set of issues to deal with. But that's another war story for another time. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we all have those war stories, but certainly the self-serving part is always interesting because I do remember a car dealership that our car manufacturer we dealt with who had the dealerships do that, and recall one of our employees getting a car and never getting the survey, but then we found his name in our system. So we know that someone filled it out, but it wasn't him. So lots of more stories to tell. I think we could probably write a book on that one, but
let me mention just one more thing, Ken, because I had that triggered the thought here. Because at the time this was being done, everything was all about the metric.
Oh yeah.
And so, it became the organization, talk about a habit that, you wouldn't be able to let go of. They became metric obsessed. It started with a satisfaction percentage number, and then it kind of flipped over to NPS. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit, but you have to be careful about what you become obsessed with, because numbers are numbers, and if you're working with a financially driven organization, that's typically what happens there, is they become number obsessed, and it becomes all about that. And then you forget all the other pieces and parts, but that's it. Another war story.
Oh, yeah. Well, and we're sort of moving into that a little bit because I mean, when we, when we think about our CX programs, I mean, I will probably go out on a limb, and I'm sure someone will skewer me for this, but I'll say there is no perfect customer experience program out there. If we think of your clients, my clients, anyone that's out there, I mean, there are definitely opportunities to make incremental changes in all their programs. I mean, some of these are simple and obvious. Shall I say survey length being one of them, obviously. Well, and that one's, I guess we'll call it more obvious than easy. It's obvious that survey length is an issue. It's not always easy to fix it. So when you speak to your clients, I mean, what are some of the smaller changes that companies should be making within their CX programs, and what's holding them back?
Good question, Ken. Well, I want to say this, that your question itself partly has the answer in it. We always recommend to our clients that they start small and work in increments. I hate to use the phrase boil the ocean, but a lot of organizations want to dive into this thing and just go headlong into it. We tend to pull them back. We work with a lot of companies that are in the earlier stages of CX maturity, and so they may not even know where to begin or how to begin. And so, they reach out to us for assistance. And when they do that, they've already started doing some CX, largely in the form of surveys on their own. They buy a survey tool that's inexpensive, easy enough to learn and use, and they take their best shot at creating a proper survey. And that typically results in a survey developed by a committee, which is pretty much a guarantee that it's going to be a long survey, since every group,
certain failure, yeah.
Oh yeah, every group or every function wants to be represented, and I want to have their questions included. I can't tell you how many times I suffered through that personally. And most of the time, it isn't a very well-developed survey because there is an art and a science behind developing a good and effective survey instrument. And there's a lot of bad practices that can surface in many of them. We see it all the time. So it's not just a matter of getting better at developing sound questions, making surveys shorter. We steer our clients back to the fundamentals. What's the objective they're trying to achieve? Yeah, what will they do with the insights and answers that their customers are providing to them? What actions will be taken? Who will be held accountable for getting back to the customer? And what will that process look like? So, we paint a picture of an entire system of, following up and closing the loop with customers. And many organizations still haven't mastered, and that's a critical component of CX. I can't tell you how many times I've run into this, a survey taken without any word back from the organization that you received it, that you read it, that you cared about it, that you did something with it, is probably a guarantee that in the future, if you ask me again, I'm not going to return the survey, because why waste my time if I'm not going to see any result? What's in it for me? There's a what's in it for me for the customer. So even before you set out to develop a research instrument or a survey instrument, you really should take the time to delineate the customer journey. And having said that, I know that's a big word, the customer journey and journey mapping, to a lot of folks, and it looks like a big nut to crack. That doesn't have to be a daunting or extremely complex task for an organization to take on themselves with a little bit of guidance. It really starts with collecting internally what you know about your customer interactions. What are the known touch points with your customers across the life cycle? What do you believe might be their experience at each phase of that journey? And we put a name to this, we call it hypothesis mapping. And once you have that well documented and agreed upon internally with your relevant functions involved, you need to validate that information with your customer base. And this can be accomplished in several different ways, but it's essential you get that nailed down from the customer's perspective. The end result of this work in understanding the customer journey is that now you'll know exactly where the customer pain points are, from which you can begin thinking about ways to address and resolve those issues. Plus, the other benefit from this is that you'll know better about what's most important to your customers and why. You'll have a better idea on what to ask, what to focus on within your surveys, and then thereby have a better and more meaningful questions and responses coupled with, and that'll lead to necessarily shorter surveys, which is, I think, is kind of a thing we're all focused on today. Having shorter and more effective surveys is appealing, to both the organization and customers. And of course, you want to be using a tool that you can easily obtain and manage and apply these and other principles and best practices. So approaches aren't difficult to master, but it does take focus and determination, as well as supportive leadership, which is a critical part of it all, and they shouldn't be bypassed. So I kind of say it that way, Ken.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, shouldn't be bypassed. I mean, there's no shortcut, and I think we've all dealt with we have to have this up and running in X weeks, and that's probably the worst reason in the world to try and get something up and running from a CX perspective. You really should have a solid approach. So I agree there.
Yeah.
Well, and then thinking of that, I mean, I've been in this industry for far too long, shall we say? When you hit a certain point, you just say 20 plus years. So I'll just leave it at that. And in this, as I mentioned, I saw some of the first reporting websites that were pushed out there. I was part of one of them, and I've seen them all evolve. I've seen features within CX come and go, things that really were out there, the new and shiny object that grabs everyone's attention, and then it turns out just to be a well-polished rock that looks shiny and pretty because it's a well-polished rock. So smooth and pretty, but mostly for show. As you know, I joined here at QuestionPro a few months ago, and I've been working on the idea of getting more with less. I mean, I probably take every survey that's thrown my way, and that's a lot of surveys. I've really been working with the idea of rolling out something that makes it shorter and easier for the customer, because doing surveys is part of that customer experience. I mean, you mentioned the journey before, and that journey, it shouldn't end with just that customer experience survey, because the customer experience survey should then lead to another experience in buying something or purchasing something. But when you're shipping those surveys out, that is part of it. I mean, the worst feeling in the world. And I have a couple of former colleagues who are listening in who know that feeling of you've sent out a survey and it has the wrong link, or you've sent out a survey and there's a misspelling in the invitation, or they have the wrong name. I mean, there's a reason that feeling is so crushing, and it's because that is part of the customer experience, and we don't want surveys to be taking away from that experience. We want surveys to be available to enhance it. So we're rolling out a feature called NPS Plus, and it's sort of getting back to that original promise of NPS. I mean, I remember when that first rolled out in 2003, it's all you have to do is ask this one ultimate question and throw on an open end. The ultimate question will give you everything you need to know, a measurement about your business and a leading indicator on the financials, and that open end will give you what you have to work on. And back when it was introduced, it was just like most things that are innovative. It had a lot of people embracing it, a lot of people rejecting it. A lot of pushback saying, nope, this is fundamentally wrong. We need to ask these 40 questions because otherwise we can't analyze data a certain way. Things of that nature. And I think adding to it, back when it was introduced, text analytics was still an emerging science. I might contend it's still emerging. I mean, every day I see some new innovations and things. I mean, it's still accelerating in the innovation. So, but we went and decided to take that NPS set. We just added one little sub question. It's not even a comment. It's just being able to tag the real significant reason, the most important reason for identifying the root cause. So it's and a comment voting, and it's two easy responses for the customer. It's click, it's not type, it's not read through pages and pages of attributes and trying to click on. Nothing more annoying than having a page of 40 attributes and trying to make sure you have the right line that you're clicking on. And so with just 4 components, we were able to provide that overall measure, and you can even weight it by revenue, identify root cause, and find areas identified and voted on by customers for innovation, which is something a little unique. We brought that over from our communities idea, where people are on there talking about concepts and ideas that they like, and giving people just the opportunity to see what other people are saying and say, hey, I like that idea. We should add fried fish to the menu, something like that. So, and then within that also, I add a financial piece, identifying your risk of churn. And for me, it follows on the goals since I got in this space. Use more of what you already know and only ask what is needed for a transactional survey. And I think that's where I've really tried to push people towards. And so I do like the suggestions portion, inviting customers not only to offer ideas, but to react to other ideas. And I remember the first time I used closed loop feedback in a CSAT program, the founder of the company stated, well, this is no longer market research. And I remember that statement, and I have to say wholeheartedly, I agree. It's customer experience research. It's not market research. It's a conversation with customers. And so, really bringing that back in a way that we have to really identify that this is a conversation with our customers. And so, you've seen all sorts of CX feedback in your career. I'll ask you the question, how do you feel about the idea of asking customers to look at other customers' comments and vote on them, and really asking them to innovate and co-create with you?
Well, let me say this. Co-creation is an important aspect of CX overall, okay? And we take that approach in our consulting work. I mean, even back in my corporate days, working on improving the overall customer experience, it was developed as a co-creative event. So this was after the fact. This is, I'm speaking after the fact, like not during the survey. And what you're talking about here is during the survey. And I think that is part of the experience is golden. Yeah. What we did is we engaged local teams, and those are the people who were responsible for the service delivery at the local level to the customers, rather than me at the corporate level saying, as the manager of customer experience, I can tell you all of the issues that are surfacing with your customers. Here's what they are, and here's what you ought to do about it. If I had done that, I'd have been like the guy from I'm here from the IRS, and I'm here to help you. And that wasn't about to happen. So we let them discover and their own customer issues and pain points and root causes for dissatisfaction. And that allowed them to set up their own ideas around process improvement and resolve those issues at the local level. So what happened, what the result was, felt more ownership and adoption because they were invested in the process, both in the discovery and in the resolutions. So, taking that idea now to customers through NPS Plus and bringing them in at the discovery end of the VOC process, I think is a brilliant way to approach it, and doing it as you described in a shorter and more efficient manner is sure to increase customer engagement and adoption and involvement. And that's way more validating by having this coming directly from the customer's perspective rather than as what I described, the internal process I used back in my corporate days. I'm thinking right now, if I'd had this tool and technique back then, it probably would have been way more powerful and effective. In some research that we did late in 2019 here at HorizonCX on whether NPS was still the primary metric of choice among B2B organizations, it turned out that it was. But I suspect that some of that was a result of, habit. And as we talked about before, we become obsessed with numbers, and NPS was like a primary metric, and we still use it because everybody else does. But now it could be creating some new lift here and excitement over a metric that a lot of organizations still continue to use and will continue to use. Just off the cuff thinking here, That might be worthy of writing a book. You know, you can call it the ultimate question revisited or the ultimate question updated.
Yeah, I don't want to infringe on any trademarks there.
Oh, no, no.
Yeah.
Pick a title.
Yeah. And I like what you're saying. I mean, I think there's a certain feeling about letting the customers be involved in that entire process that is terrific. And I mean, there are a lot of benefits to how the team put this all together. You know, there's a churn risk measurement, for example. Like, it goes beyond. I mean, we can assume that our detractors are at risk of churning. I mean, I think that's a fair assumption everyone would make. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. We focus on that and try to measure that in different ways than you're describing here, but this is right on track here.
Yeah, and you know, so we have a closed loop recovery system for them, but what we sometimes forget to look at is the passives, that middle child. I'm a middle child, so I get this complex about it. So, but we sometimes forget about those passives, and that, you know, they could. We talk about promoting them and making them into promoters, but sometimes we forget that they can be detractors as well, just as easily. They're right on that fence. And so being able to look at them and say, you know, do they fit the profile more like a promoter, or do they fit the profile that looks more like a detractor? And then be able to give some information about it. And even if we needed to, be able to flag them and say, well, they're a passive, but they're a passive that you probably should follow up with because they have the same complaints from a root cause perspective that the detractors have. So,
and I think, you know, Ken, that's important information to know, because one thing just triggered a thought in my mind here. We'll go backwards a little bit to easy changes that you can make within your customer experience process. And, you know, because when NPS was introduced, the focus was all on those detractors and how that fought. Well, what should we do with the detractors? I mean, they surface because they're making more noise. You know, they're in the red, as you can see on your graphs over here. But I was always a constant proponent of closing the loop with customers regardless of the way they answered that question. So I advocated for follow up with detractors, passives, and promoters. And now you've kind of analyzed that to a little bit finer degree here by looking at passives to see, are they more inclined to lean one way or the other? But I think it's important. That's a thing that I think, you know, it doesn't have to be an overwhelming task either, because you can be divided and conquered. I mean, it depends on the organization, but it's just a different conversation. I mean, if you were to call up and follow up with the detractor, you know what that conversation is going to be like. And what we would do is
an uncomfortable one sometimes.
Yeah. And, you know, and certain people in the organization would be reluctant to want to do that. So we gave them a starting point. We gave them a script. Okay, start from here. But we also gave them a script and a starting point for when you have a passive. And that conversation went a little bit differently. And then when you had a promoter, that obviously went a lot differently. But the follow-up that the customer wasn't expecting, you know, if you're a detractor and you say something really ugly and bad in a survey, you might think that somebody would follow up with you. I've done that myself. I've answered questions on surveys in, you know, ways that I would get somebody's attention, right? And so I got the call back and I got the satisfaction of having somebody close the loop with me. You're not going to get the expectation when you answer in kind of neutral fashion, even in a positive fashion. You might not even expect that. So it's an element of surprise, let's say, to your customers that to do the follow-up regardless. And again, it's situation dependent, but I'm a big proponent of follow-up with a customer regardless, because that will help guarantee, again, that you're going to get, the next time you go out there looking for feedback from your customers, they're more likely to give it because they know that it results in something.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we want that to be. We want them to feel like if they're giving feedback, it's acknowledged. And it's like you said at the beginning, I mean, don't just give a thank you page and then never acknowledge that they, especially when you're talking, it's a little more difficult if you're talking a grocery store, but if you're talking in a business to business environment, having that follow up every time is so important to be able to even just thank them for their feedback, whether it's overwhelmingly positive feedback, negative feedback, which everyone should embrace negative feedback. It's an opportunity to save a customer. But even the passives in the middle of the road in a business environment, it's critical where the customers are a finite set of customers. You need to make sure that you acknowledge that feedback and that you keep getting more, so that if things move in a negative direction, that it's moving and you can fix it. And if it's moving in a positive, you realize that you have a promoter and you can work more closely with them and collaborate with them. It's a huge factor for me in being able to work more closely with my clients. So with the last few minutes we have left, I sort of want to look into the future. We hear words like AI and machine learning, and I know they're vital, and we should be asking less and analyzing more. I'm a huge proponent of that. From your perspective, what are the innovations that CX practitioners and their clients should be looking to do in the future? What should they be learning? What should they be understanding?
Well, that's a good question, Ken. And I like the slide, by the way, this little thing that looks like we're hopping from one level to the next, and it looks like a CX maturity curve. So I like it for that reason. One of the things, I'm going to start here. One of the things I've been hearing a lot about lately, and it surfaced as part of the pandemic, is the advice from some to not continue to reach out to customers for feedback. I don't know if you've heard that, Ken. You might have. And then,
I have, and I've heard some people saying that, but I'll let you continue.
Yeah, the reason, in theory at least, it seems to me, is that the pandemic has created a lot of havoc and upset in people's lives in terms of following, safety protocols, working remotely, skyrocketing unemployment, furloughs, layoffs, and in some instances, businesses shutting down temporarily. We've seen that a lot in the restaurant in the hospitality sector, even closing for good. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty right now. And in my humble opinion, this would not be the best time to slow down communicating with or asking your customers for feedback. And I think quite the opposite. But it's a matter of how you communicate and what you're asking from them. And if it feels like solicitation and there's nothing that says what's in it for me, for them, it won't likely be effective. I'm sure we've all likely received those emails in our inbox that begin with the words, "in these uncertain times." And I usually cringe when I read that. And then they end with the words, "we're all in this together." To the point where much of that communication is meaningless. So to the extent that you can, I think it would be a golden opportunity to pick up the phone and call your customers, especially those that you consider to be either premier or critical to your business or business continuity. And that conversation should be just that, a conversation, not a pitch for any new product or service, but simply to be there and be willing to listen and to help your customer in any way you can. It sounds pretty low tech here, but I think, Ken, when you were talking about NPS Plus, and I think of all those, instances where those are golden opportunities to reach out to customers, that there's a good argument for conversation to be had right there.
Exactly.
I worked, I'll let you respond to that, Ken, just because I think you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
No, exactly. I mean, it is, as you mentioned, this is a ripe opportunity for us to, you mentioned all the emails you got. I actually started putting them into a folder, and I think in a typical month, I was getting 110, 120 messages a month about the measures that we're taking in response to COVID. And I kept thinking, you never asked me what would make me feel comfortable. You were telling me what you think would make you feel comfortable, but not me. So,
yep, you gotta really be focusing on the what's in it for them, the customer. So here's a little perspective here. I worked for a while in the automation business, and there was a saying there that went kind of like this: if you automate a flawed process, you only can expect the result is that you're going to have a faulty product or a faulty process even faster. So, likewise, when you look at, when you say artificial intelligence, I always cringe at the word artificial. I'm not sure I trust artificial. I like the real things. But anyway, that aside, I see automating customer service and the resulting customer experience having a tendency to follow, a similar kind of path. The way we look at it is, from our perspective here, from HorizonCX perspective, is if you need to have mastered the basics first and get them right, and only then can you think about automating in the form of artificial intelligence or whatever it takes to take you to that next higher level of performance. Innovation doesn't have to mean the next new shiny object or just simply getting the fundamentals right in the first place. I had an experience 2 days ago in my home. Everybody has an ALEXA, and I can't say that because there's one next to me. And if I say it, it's going to answer me. But something came, I have an ALEXA that's a screen, and it said something on there, and I asked it a question. And it said to me, do you want me to call such and such vendor by name with access code XXX? And I'm like, how the heck did you know the access code? How did you know that that was a vendor that I work with? And how did you know my access code? I'm real curious about that. And then, of course, you start thinking about, well, what does ALEXA also know about me? Do they know my telephone number? Do they know my social security number? What else do they know? So it got me, that's why I say I'm always a little bit nervous when I hear artificial intelligence. Anyway, I don't know if you had an experience like that, Ken.
Oh, yeah, certainly. There's times, I think my favorite, I actually liked the experience. An airline that I fly with frequently, not so much lately, but have flown with frequently, it knows my phone number when I call in. And it says, welcome, Kenneth. And then the next line is, are you calling about your flight today? Or, are you calling about this reservation? So it's actually looking at what it knows about me and then identifying me and saying, this might be what you're talking about. And it's automation. I still, it's still an algorithm. I like to say it's not artificial intelligence, it's algorithm injection, basically, sort of pushing us along a path, but it's a smarter path. But yeah, so that's an example of where I like it. So far, I haven't had my device in my office that will remain nameless tell me something that I didn't even know about myself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, because that access code, I can say honestly, I'd forgotten what it was, but I went and checked and I found out, oh my God, it really is. It knew my access code. But I know what you mean too, and I've called other businesses where just from my phone number, it'll answer and it'll say, hi, Carl, we see you're calling from your cell phone number, something like that. So I kind of appreciate when it knows things about me so that we can get past a lot of the stuff because I don't like the vast array of questions I get asked sometimes just to validate who I am when I call a business. But, we recognize here at HorizonCX the basics. And our training courses, they aim straight for that core knowledge and skills that you can build upon and as you go along your CX journey. When I began in this discipline back in 2004, which I mentioned, I was with Tyco, I had nothing really to help me learn the basics. So I reached out to others that I thought could help. I read as many books as I could on the topic. If a book had customer experience in the title, I was on Amazon buying it. I attended a lot of webinars like this one. And then in 2011, when the CXPA came into existence, and I jumped in the deep end of the pool with them. And, for me, it was a solid 10 years of trial and error and eventual success when I left that corporate position in 2014. But I felt I was in a position now to give back to those up and coming in CX in ways that weren't available to me at the time when I first started. So our focus is on the beginners in this business, and that applies to both individuals and organizations. And We help them learn the fundamentals to which we lend our experiences, those that we learn through trial and error, so that they could accelerate past what took us a lot longer to achieve, rather than, I hear this from a lot of other folks I talk to that are in customer experience roles and they've been working at it for 7 or 8 years, and they've gotten to a point where I got to 7 or 8 years into it myself, and I said, there's got to be a way to accelerate this a little bit faster. So we currently have courses that we offer for the manager of a CX function or the manager of a contact center, and they both focus on fundamentals of customer experience. And so I'll just mention a few of the things we talk about here. We talk about experience design. We talk about strategies. We look at CX as a system. We talk about governance, assessments, where are you on the maturity curve? And so it's important to know where you are to begin with to plan where you want to be. Customer journeys we talk about, survey instrument design, deployment techniques, case management, closing loop analysis, and change management. Change management now has become a huge interest in the world of customer experience, because a lot of what we're learning for the purposes of finding those root causes and making changes. And changes are not always easily done in an organization. Change is hard. People are resistant to change. We talked about that.
We talked about that a lot, yeah.
Yeah. So, we look at CX from a systems perspective, not as a function or a department or a part-time responsibility given to someone, in marketing to do in addition to their regular job, but a specific responsibility for an individual to manage with direct and active support from senior leadership. Incredibly important part of this. And without that last bit, you're not likely to make much progress or mature very quickly. And that's why, these steps look like they take so long to get there, because you don't have that support. So we really think that's key. Just to give a little more information about those classes, we have them regularly scheduled every month. They run for 2 hours during the evening. They're instructor-led, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. And they're 3 nights during 1 week and 3 nights during the following week, and that's a total of 12 hours. It's live instructor-led, as I mentioned, as opposed to self-paced. So participants get to interact with the facilitators, ask lots of questions, learn from each other. There's experiential exercises and homework. Yes, homework. You get interactive. And after the training's over, the participants are now open to complete an exam, which will earn them a CX Pro certificate when they pass that exam. And they get this all for a pretty reasonable price. And I think we agreed, Ken, that on this webinar, that anyone on this webinar or who registered for this webinar would get an additional $100 discount off the registration fee.
Yep.
And I think there's a link that's going to be put somewhere in the chat, I believe.
And AJ has put the link in the chat for you, and we'll also email it out after to everyone.
Oh, fantastic. So yeah, and classes, actually there's a class starting next Tuesday, which I'm not sure, it's pretty soon. So I'm not sure that one's going to be the one of most interest, but there is another class starting on October 20th. They all run Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on 1 week, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday following week, 6 to 8. So, convenient after kind of normal working hours. And then in November, on the 10th, we start the CX Pro for contact center leaders. And that's starting November 10, 11, and 12. And in 2021, we have in our sites CX Pro class for customer service and support teams. So those are futures. And I did want to mention a couple other things that while people are may be interested in here, we do some research at HorizonCX, and we've done a couple of that folks may be interested in, and these are available at no charge. We did an NPS report on how NPS was being used and whether it was continued to be the primary or key performance indicator of customer experience in B2B organizations. We did this work in late 2019. That report in a PDF format is available at no charge. And we did a contact center research report earlier this year, and that is in a PDF format. and available at no charge. I think that latter one, there might be a banner on our website, www.horizoncx.com, where you can request that. But if you go to the Contact Us page on the website and say, I want both reports, just all you have to do is say, I want both reports, and I'll email both of those PDF reports to anyone who asks.
And what if I say I want all three?
What's the third one?
I'm terrific. Thank you. And,
you know what? Well, guess what? If somebody says they want all three, we'll find something.
We'll find one for you.
Well, it'll be a bonus. How's that?
Well, and I appreciate you coming on board, and definitely go over and check out HorizonCX.com and just see some of the content. Ask for those reports. That I've seen them; they're terrific, and you do a good job of. I call it the research on research, which is probably an overused term, but you really do bring out some of the things that we should be looking at as CX professionals, and you definitely talk about it in your course, which is terrific. And people really should take the opportunity to check that out, especially with the additional discount that we're offering here. So we had a couple of questions come in, and AJ, I'll take these on. I'll start with the first one, with the focus being on shortening surveys. What would you say are the best practices for collecting detailed information about member experience? For example, if you only ask basic experience questions, when you get a negative response, you don't know why it was negative. Do you try to bridge the data gap with things like text analytics, or do you reach out afterwards to get testimonials, things like this? The answer is yes, all of them. I think part of when we were talking about the approach to shortening the survey, and I'm happy to, anyone that wants to look at a demonstration of what I was referring to with NPS Plus, we actually include a little bit of what we call root cause tags in there. So as soon as they answer the question, if they answer it as a promoter, detractor, or passive, there'll actually be a list, a subset of categories that can come up where you can actually tag. The person can tag the one thing that really stood out at them. So if it's, why did you, rate us so well, there's a list, and it's just one click, and they can say that was the key reason. And that's what we're looking for, is that key reason. It's always easy to say, oh, well, it's one or two, it's three, or it's 4 or 5 things. But, we can make it short and concise by saying, what's the one thing that stood out? And we can do the same thing on the other spectrum with detractors and even with passives. What could we do to improve? So, being able to condense that instead of asking a battery of questions, and then still asking the open end, is pretty much where we're trying to get that focus. And I do believe open ends provide a lot of rich information. I think the NPS question is the what, and then we can do the why, top reason, and then why in more detail, so that they have that opportunity to continue the conversation. I think too many surveys nowadays look more like a one-sided conversation. We're going to ask you 50 questions, but we don't want you to respond with why you feel that way. We just want you to give a rating for all these things. So I think the other part, and Carl, I'd love for you to weigh in on this one as well, is I'm a huge advocate of having both transactional surveys, which can happen after each and every transaction, but very short, very concise, and a relationship survey, particularly if you're talking where there's a lot of transactions over a time period, over the year, over the relationship. I really don't like those transactional questions that start asking you everything from your demographics to your spend to you name it. Sometimes, what other brands do you use, that kind of thing, all within the context of a transactional survey. Sometimes those transactional surveys are longer than the actual transaction themselves. So, we should be really cognizant of the time, but I believe in a good blend of having a relationship survey where you really can get into the details. Jump in, use a relationship survey once a year to jump in and find out how they feel about your organization, other organizations. Find out their spend across those things. So all these questions that we ask that we want to know, and I think the old hook was, hey, we already have them on the line, so let's just go ahead and ask it. Let's just do a relationship survey once a year, twice a year. Really incent them to do it. It doesn't have to be a monetary incentive, but explain to them, we're doing this so we can serve you better. Could be as simple as that, but that way that information that you have to collect that doesn't change often is still available to you, and then that shorter transactional survey, you can then link it. I mean, that's the promise of data analytics, and I could go on for hours about that, but Karl, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, I agree with what you say here. We talk about relationship surveys as being either an annual or semi-annual type of an event. And they're more probing, and you want to get at the heart of things, which means it's going to be more qualitative than it is quantitative. But I'll go back to something that you said earlier. Don't ask what you already know. We made this mistake years ago. We asked the customers in a survey how long they'd been a customer with us. And of course, you can imagine the answers that came back. Like, you're asking me that? You should be telling me that. So, you have to be careful of those things. But, what's interesting here, though, is to talk about transactional surveys and using NPS, because in the original concept of NPS was meant to be in a relationship survey, not a transactional survey. But in my experience, I've used NPS as a metric in all surveys, whether they be transactional or relationship. And I think somebody asked here, I look like in the Q&A here, about a Forbes article, which I haven't read, that said that the NPS question is too passive versus actual, and how likely are you to recommend would be been replaced maybe by how often do you recommend. And I actually have done that within surveys. NPS is a high level indicator, so by itself, and of course with the NPS plus, now you're going to get more out of it, you can extract more out of it. But I did ask in a particular survey, I was working with an organization, we started asking for how many times over the past year have you recommended blank organization to others? And it was very interesting because we asked that question of whether they advised. The leading question was, have you recommended or advised against? So those that advised against and those that had advocated for, you'd be interested to know that the average recommendation was 10 instances of recommending the organization to others. I'm sorry, advising against was 10 instances of advising against and 2 instances of recommending. So when somebody says they will advise against when they've had a bad experience, you can really pretty much expect there's going to be more of them. They're a squeakier wheel, they're louder, and somebody who recommends is going to be probably on the lower side of that. It was on average, there were 2 recommendations over a period of a year. I don't know how that strikes you, Ken, from maybe experiences you've had, but it was surprising to us.
Yeah, and it's very similar. And I mean, I remember when I first got into the industry hearing something along those lines, like, yeah, every detractor, although it wasn't detractor at the time, every dissatisfied customer tells 10 people, and every extremely happy customer tells 1 or 2, so it's, it's an old adage that's almost basically proven by the work that you were doing, that but it does, it does bring to light the idea that how likely are you to recommend is pretty much a proxy for anything else. One of the things that we're working on from a research perspective is a former colleague of mine wrote extensively about NPS. Wasn't a huge advocate, let's put it that way. But ultimately, when he came back to the conclusion that he found was basically all the measures, if we tried to link them to financial outcomes, for example, all the measures were almost the same in terms of their correlation to financial outcomes. And that's because they're really a proxy for how that customer is feeling. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into, hey, between I'm a customer that is a passive detractor or promoter to this is how much I spend with your organization. So there's a lot of things that factor into that. And even me recommending, Carl, I can highly recommend Emirates first class suite on their 787s. I mean, they're amazing. Now, I've never been in them because I can't afford them, and I doubt you'll be able to afford them, but hey, I can highly recommend it. So sometimes there are other factors that go along with those recommendations, right. But it does give you the general impression that, you know, if I had an extra $33,000 lying around, yeah, I would definitely take that Emirates first class suite. So, you know, there's those things that you have to remember that when you're starting to tie it back financially and looking to connect it to, you know, is it really an action-based question?
Yeah, I think, you know, it has to be, because you think about it for a moment. How likely would you be to, if you were inclined to do so? It's a hypothetical question. You know, it's not an actual, you know, unless you ask somebody actually, did they do it? You have no idea. I mean, but you know, you do get valuable information out of that question. There's no doubt about it. The fact that, you know, that through our B2B research, we found that, you know, it's very much alive as the primary metric. It was in late 2019 in B2B companies, and I suspect that it will continue in 2020 and beyond. But it is, you know, it's usually used in combination with some others, you know, overall satisfaction, or CSAT, you know, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's been around for a long time too, you know, so people look at that as well. But you're right, unless you start correlating with your operational data, and we hear a lot about that today, about X and O, and sounds like tic-tac-toe.
Yeah.
But you know, it makes sense, right? You know, we're looking for ways that will explain if this thing is moving in this direction, are we seeing a result in our business moving in that same direction?
We had another question come in, and this is, I don't know if we can answer this appropriately in a couple of minutes, but I'm happy if you want to follow up with me directly when you get the thank you email. But as an educator in the K through 12 public school system, is there anything that you are working on concerning improving our education system and instruction that I can look more closely at? And I think, by the way, I'll note, I mean, this is a lifetime ago. I used to be a high school math teacher. Not a lot of people know that about me.
But, I didn't know that,
Ken. Yes, and it was a long time ago. Let's just put it that way. And I enjoyed teaching, loved working with students. I think that the most difficult part when it comes to something like education is the stakeholders. And it's easy to say, oh, well, the stakeholders are the students and the teachers. Well, no, there's also the parents, and oh, by the way, the local community and the school board. And so when we think of, you know, an education system, even in a small microcosm at a local level, they're all customers really of what you're offering, the service that you're offering to the community. So I'm happy to jump into that in a little more detail on a one-on-one, because I think that would be an hour conversation in itself that I think we could have. And then we had one more come in. I haven't read do you have any recommendations to increase responses to open-end questions, as we rely more on open-end responses, only 20 to 25%, which I think is about accurate. Put in a comment. And I mean, for me, it's, if you make that promise up front that says, like in the case of NPS Plus, we're only going to ask you to click 4 times and do an open end. That really sets them up to know what they're in for. I think part of the problem nowadays with surveys is, I'll pull a very recent example. We're telling people it's going to be a 3 to 5 minute survey, and it turns into 5 to 7. So already you're breaking that promise with your customer. And then no sooner did we update the text to make it 5 to 7, the client comes back and says, oh, I need to add a few more questions because we're not getting what we want. And I said, well, we need to update it to say 7 to 9. And they say, but we don't know that yet. But regardless of whether you know it, you know it's going to be longer. You know, you're asking them to commit time to this process. So we should really, let them know what they're expecting up front, and you'll get a better outcome. If you, I guess the other way is to force it to, make them answer the question, but then you get really bad responses. But I realize that we're up against the hour, and I want to thank everyone for attending. Karl, thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you and really enjoy learning what you have to say. And for everyone on the phone, if you have the chance, definitely go over to HorizonCX. You'll get the discount code through the thank you email. But definitely check out Karl and what he's doing there at HorizonCX, so that you have an opportunity to really learn how you can innovate your CX and learn how to be a better CX practitioner. So thank you, Karl.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you everyone who came on the webinar.